Witness how a quiet act of disrespect on a routine flight spirals into something no one on board will ever forget. When a veteran is pushed too far, the world has a way of paying attention. Let us know in the comments section below if you've ever witnessed a moment where one voice made a difference. David Graham adjusted the brim of his worn cap, the insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division stitched proudly on the front. His hand steady despite the scars time had carved into his skin, lightly brushed against the overhead bin as he moved down the narrow aisle. Seat 14A, window seat, just as his daughter had insisted when she booked his ticket. Easier for his knees, she'd said, and David had learned a long time ago to pick his battles wisely. He slid into the seat, offering a polite nod to the elderly woman in 14B, who smiled back with the warm weariness of a seasoned traveler. David settled himself, careful not to bump his neighbor, placing his small duffel beneath the seat ahead. He drew a slow breath, feeling the hum of the plane through the soles of his boots, not unlike the vibrations of a C-130 Hercules back in the day. Different era, different mission. He barely noticed the murmur of the boarding passengers or the static crackle of the flight attendant's announcements. His focus was on the photo he'd tucked into the pocket of his shirt, a snapshot of a little girl holding a teddy bear, now a grown woman he hadn't seen in 3 long years. Further up the aisle, flight attendant Samantha Greer checked her tablet with sharp, clipped motions. Her Navy uniform was immaculate, her blonde hair pulled tight into a bun that left no strand free. Efficiency was her armor against a world of unruly passengers and endless delays. Her jaws set tighter when she spotted David in 14A. Samantha tapped her tablet screen twice. Her shift had started rough, and her patience was already wearing thin. She wasn't in the mood for seat jumpers, and something about the old man's casual confidence rubbed her the wrong way. Approaching with brisk steps, Samantha stopped beside David and glanced at the seat numbers without a smile. "Sir, I believe you're in the wrong seat," she said, her voice more command than inquiry. David looked up, polite but firm. "This is 14A, right?" He gestured to the placard just above the window. Samantha barely glanced before shaking her head. "Your boarding pass, please." David fished it out carefully, his hands moving slower than they used to, and handed it over. Samantha snatched it without thanks, scanning it quickly. For a beat, her brow furrowed. It was the correct seat. But the press of impatient passengers behind her made her decision for her. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move until we verify with the gate agent," she said. Her tone had the brittle edge of someone issuing an order, not a request. David's mouth tightened. "Ma'am, with respect, this is my assigned seat." A few passengers nearby began to glance over, sensing the tension. The woman in 14B shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to help but uncertain whether to speak up. Samantha crossed her arms. "If you don't comply, I'll have to call security before we can take off." The words hung in the air, heavier than the recycled oxygen. David felt 1,000 old instincts sharpen within him. Not fear, not anger, but the deep, abiding knowledge of when a fight needed to be fought. His voice stayed calm. "I'm not moving." Samantha's lips pressed into a hard line, but before she could fire back, David pulled out his phone. A few quick taps, and he lifted it to his ear. "Hey, Jason," he said, his voice level. "Yeah, it's Dad. Listen, I'm going to need a favor. I'm on flight 482, gate G16. You might want to get in touch with the airline's legal department." "Yeah, I'll hold." Across the aisle, a young couple quietly pulled out their phones and began recording. A few more passengers turned in their seats, the atmosphere shifting from irritation to curiosity to unease. The plane wasn't moving yet, but it suddenly felt like everyone was going somewhere none of them had planned. Samantha's smile reappeared, thin, brittle, and disparate. "Sir, you're causing a disturbance," she said, louder, trying to regain control. David didn't look at her. "Jason?" "Yeah, they're threatening to remove me. Seat 14A." "Correct." I'll stay on the line." The woman beside him leaned in and whispered, "You're in the right seat, dear, I saw it." David gave her a small nod of thanks without breaking his phone connection. In the front galley, another flight attendant, noticing the commotion, picked up the intercom and quietly called for the captain. Behind David, the restless shuffle of passengers was growing. Murmurs, camera phones tilted slightly higher. Samantha could feel the ground slipping under her heels. This was supposed to be easy. Move the old man, get the flight off on time. But now, eyes were locking onto her every move, and the little red recording lights on the phones were like silent witnesses. The captain appeared, striding down the aisle with the calm authority that only years of piloting could grant. His gaze moved between David, Samantha, and the quietly gathering crowd. "What's the situation here?" he asked, low and steady. Samantha, for the first time, hesitated. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then said, "Passenger in wrong seat, refusing to comply." David slowly handed his boarding pass up to the captain, who examined it carefully. A beat, 2. Then the captain handed it back with a nod. "Is in the correct seat," the captain said clearly, making sure the surrounding passengers heard every word. His eyes flicked to Samantha. "Let's de-escalate, please." The hum of the plane seemed to shift. Like a living thing, the crowd's energy snapped from silent judgment to heavy disapproval, aimed squarely at Samantha. Samantha swallowed hard, her face flushing. For a second she looked like she might double down, but she straightened her shoulders, gave David a tight nod, and stalked up the aisle toward the galley without another word. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Across from him, a teenage boy gave him a small thumbs up. David chuckled quietly and tucked his phone away. Jason's voice was still on the line. "You good, Dad?" David smiled faintly. "For now, son. But stay close. I've got a feeling this isn't over yet." Outside the window, the last few bags were being loaded onto the cargo hold. Inside, a silent pact seemed to form among the passengers, eyes alert, phones at the ready. The fight for dignity wasn't just David's anymore. It belonged to all of them. The phone in David Graham's shirt pocket buzzed faintly against his chest. He didn't need to check to know it was Jason. His son wouldn't leave things hanging once he sensed a wrong needed setting right. David tapped the call to life with a thumb, pressing it gently to his ear. "I've spoken to their legal office," Jason said, voice tight but professional. "They're scrambling right now. Stay calm, Dad. Help is on the way." David's lips curved into a small, wry smile. Staying calm was never the hard part. He had walked through fire before. A rude flight attendant wasn't about to rattle him. Still, there was a sharpness in the air now, a crackling sense of unpredictability, like standing just outside a storm's reach. Across the aisle, more passengers had taken notice. A woman in business attire pretended to read her magazine, but her phone's lens peeked over the top edge. A teenage boy craned his neck for a better look, while his mother kept whispering, trying in vain to get him to sit back. The captain lingered near the front, conferring quietly with another flight attendant, who was no doubt filling him in on the fallout that had begun to spill over social media. The pilot's face was a tight mask of irritation, not at David, but at the situation spiraling beyond their control. In the galley, Samantha Greer was pacing. Her hands fluttered to her hair, smoothing strands that weren't even out of place. Every few seconds she would check the cabin through the narrow slit of the curtain, her eyes narrowing when they landed on David, still seated, unbothered, still talking softly on the phone. "What's the delay?" a man called out from a few rows back, loudly enough that the tension snapped taut. "I have a connection in Denver." "Yeah," a woman added, pushing her sunglasses up her nose. "Can we get this plane moving or what?" Samantha took that as her cue. She emerged from behind the galley curtain, smoothing her skirt, her voice artificially sweet when she spoke over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We are working through a minor seating issue and will be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience." David caught the stiff way she smiled, the brittle glint behind her eyes. She wanted him gone? Not because of the seat anymore, but because she knew she had lost control. Pride was a dangerous thing in close quarters. Jason's voice returned to his ear. "Listen carefully, Dad. Their senior legal rep is ordering them to deboard the plane, if necessary, but not you. You're to remain seated. They know, now, you're in the right." David's smile deepened slightly. "Appreciate you, son." The line clicked off, but David knew Jason wouldn't hang back. His boy had inherited a fierce stubbornness and a sense of justice that came from watching his old man all those years. Suddenly, a young woman, early 20s, messy bun, hoodie with a veteran support logo, stood up 2 rows behind David. She turned toward the back, holding up her phone. "Just so everybody knows," she said loudly, her voice shaking a little but growing stronger. "This man is a veteran. He's not causing a problem. He's sitting where he's supposed to be. I have it recorded." Heads turned. A ripple of murmurs moved through the plane like wind through dry grass. Samantha's cheeks turned the color of sunburn, but she pushed forward. "Ma'am," she said with a sharp, warning tone, "please stay seated. This is not your concern." The young woman's hands didn't lower. "It is my concern. It's everyone's concern when people are treated unfairly." David turned his head slightly, catching her eye. He gave her a small, grateful nod. She nodded back, chin lifting a little higher. The captain strode forward again. He took the intercom this time himself, his voice slow, deliberate, cutting across the cabin like a blade. "This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing an internal personnel issue that must be addressed prior to takeoff. At this time, we are required to return to the gate. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The groans and protests grew louder. Business travelers cursed under their breath. Families sighed heavily. But nobody could miss the captain's use of the word personnel. David leaned back against the headrest, feeling the shift fully settle now. This wasn't just a scuffle anymore. This was an event. In the galley, Samantha's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She ducked behind the curtain again, speaking into a handset phone mounted by the food carts. Her voice, though low, leaked out, words sharp and frantic. "I'm being harassed," she hissed. "The veteran is—" The curtain whipped aside. The captain himself stood there, eyes hard. "Enough," he said, voice low enough that only a few in the first rows could hear, but deadly serious. "You are relieved of duties on this flight." Samantha's mouth fell open. For a moment she simply stood there, stunned. Then, seeing the captain's expression wasn't shifting, she snapped the curtain shut again with unnecessary force. A few minutes later, the announcement came. "Flight 482 passengers, please remain seated. We will be returning to the gate. Certain crew adjustments are being made." David exhaled slowly. In the seat next to him, the woman he'd first greeted smiled broadly. "You handled that with real class," she said. David offered her a small, tired chuckle. "Learned a long time ago. Stay steady. Don't let them see you rattled." The plane taxied back toward the terminal, every thrum of the tires against the runway feeling like a small drumbeat of victory. At the gate, security officers and a man in a dark gray suit were already waiting. The man wore an airline badge and carried himself with the unmistakable posture of someone used to putting out fires. He boarded quickly, nodded at the captain, and made his way to David's row. "Mr. Graham?" he asked quietly. David nodded. "I'm David Monroe, Director of Customer Relations for North Pacific Airlines," the man said, keeping his voice low but respectful. "On behalf of the company, I want to personally apologize for your experience. We are addressing it immediately." David studied him for a beat, then gave a slight nod. "Appreciate that. Hope you mean it." Mundale gave a rueful half-smile. "Sir, by the time we're done, you'll see how seriously we take it." The man straightened up and turned, gesturing toward the front. "Miss Greer, you'll need to deplane," he said, voice clear enough that the first 5 rows heard every syllable. There was a beat of silence, then a low, almost imperceptible murmur of approval from the passengers. Phones clicked to capture the moment as Samantha, face pale now, instead of flushed, gathered her bag and walked stiffly toward the exit. She didn't meet David's eyes. He didn't need her to. Justice wasn't always a grand speech or a flashing headline. Sometimes it was simply standing your ground until the truth was too loud to ignore. As Samantha disappeared down the jet bridge, David felt the plane lighten. Not physically, but spiritually, somehow. A wrong had been set right, but he knew better than to think it was over yet. The true impact was still building, a wave forming far out at sea. And it was coming. The engines stayed silent, a rare stillness filling the cabin as the passengers sat in an uneasy, expectant quiet. David Graham shifted slightly in his seat, his old knees complaining from the prolonged sitting, but he ignored the discomfort. His focus remained steady, eyes tracing the movements of David Monroe as he spoke in hushed tones with the captain near the front. They were close enough now that David could catch fragments of the conversation. "We'll have to file a full incident report. Legal's already involved," Monroe was saying, rubbing the bridge of his nose like a man carrying the weight of 1,000 bad decisions not personally his fault. The captain nodded gravely. "I'll back it up." The passenger followed every instruction. Greer escalated something that wasn't there. Passengers nearby leaned in, pretending not to eavesdrop, but barely disguising their interest. It wasn't every day you found yourself in the middle of a brewing corporate scandal. David's phone buzzed again in his pocket. Pulling it out carefully, he thumbed the call to life. "Jason," he said quietly. "Dad?" Jason's voice was sharper now, adrenaline threading through his calm. "You're trending." David's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Trending?" Jason chuckled, a short breath of disbelief. "There's already video footage all over social media. Your name hasn't come out yet, but it's being shared like wildfire. 'Veteran stands ground against airline harassment.' That's one of the headlines." David let out a low, rumbling laugh that surprised even himself. "Never thought I'd go viral sitting in a window seat." Jason's voice softened. "You're making people proud, Dad. Really proud." David's fingers curled gently around the edge of the armrest. Pride wasn't the reason he stayed seated, wasn't the reason he'd made that call. It was about principle. It was about dignity. A man didn't stop being a soldier just because the uniform was hung in the back of a closet. Monroe approached again, this time crouching slightly to speak at David's eye level. "Mr. Graham," he said, voice low enough to be private but firm enough to carry authority, "we're finalizing arrangements to continue the flight. A new flight attendant team is on their way. Additionally, I wanted you to know—" He hesitated, then pushed on. "The airline president herself is aware of this situation." David nodded once. "Glad to hear it. I appreciate you handling it properly." Monroe's face was sincere when he said, "We'll be making an announcement shortly. You'll hear it first. We're moving fast to make this right." True to his word, minutes later the cabin speakers crackled to life. The captain's voice filled the cabin. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your extraordinary patience. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be welcoming a new crew shortly. Additionally, North Pacific Airlines would like to offer all passengers on this flight a voucher toward a future flight, as a thank you for your understanding." A smattering of polite applause filled the cabin, but there was no mistaking the real applause that lived behind the claps. A surge of approval for the man still sitting in 14A. David caught the eye of the young woman in the hoodie who had first spoken up on his behalf. She grinned and gave him a thumbs up. He tipped his cap slightly in return. Across the aisle, another woman leaned toward him. She was older, maybe in her early 60s, silver hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. "My father served in Korea," she said quietly. "Would have been proud of you today." David's throat tightened unexpectedly. He managed a quiet, "Thank you." The tension in the cabin had shifted now. It wasn't tight or fearful anymore. It was charged with something else. Solidarity. A shared understanding that sometimes, in small places, against small injustices, battles still had to be fought. A new set of flight attendants boarded briskly, moving with quiet professionalism as they prepped the plane. One of them, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, paused by David's seat. "Mr. Graham?" he said softly. "That's me," David replied. The attendant smiled warmly. "Just wanted to say welcome aboard, sir. We're honored to have you with us." David nodded, his heart squeezing unexpectedly at the simple, heartfelt words. "Thank you." The engines finally roared to life beneath the wings. As the plane taxied back toward the runway, David closed his eyes for a moment, letting the rumble of power beneath him drown out the rest of the world. The plane lifted into the sky, climbing smoothly, the city shrinking away beneath them. In the pocket of his shirt, the photo of his daughter seemed to pulse with life. He was on his way, and somehow, in ways neither he nor Jason could have predicted, on his way to something bigger than just a family reunion. The drink service began once the plane leveled out, and David accepted a small bottle of water from the new flight attendant. Across the aisle, a young couple whispered and giggled, finally unable to resist any longer. The young man leaned over slightly. "Sir?" he said. "Is it okay if I ask you something?" David turned to face him fully, giving a small, encouraging nod. "Did you really call a lawyer mid-flight?" the young man asked, half in awe, half in admiration. David chuckled. "Called my son. He's a lawyer." The young woman chimed in. "That was so awesome." David smiled. "Sometimes," he said, "you have to be ready to stand your ground, even if it's just about a seat on a plane." The young man nodded solemnly. "I'll remember that." David tipped his head, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. Seeds planted in small moments often grew into something bigger, he knew. Later, when the cabin lights dimmed for the long haul across the country, David sat in the gentle dark, reflecting. His life had been a long series of battles. Some fought with weapons, some fought with words, many fought inside his own mind when the nights got too long. But always the same lesson carried through. You fight for dignity, yours, others, even when the world says, "Sit down," especially then. A notification pinged gently on his phone. Jason had texted, "Dad, you're on national news. They're calling you the veteran who refused to move. Stay strong. Proud of you." David let the screen dim and stared out the window at the velvet-back sky speckled with distant stars. He hadn't set out to become a story. But maybe, just maybe, the story was exactly what people needed. Maybe standing firm wasn't just for yourself, it was for everyone who hadn't been able to. The plane hummed steadily toward the horizon, and David Graham leaned his head back against the seat, a small, contented smile tracing his lips. The fight was just beginning, and he was ready. The seatbelt sign flickered off with a soft chime, and the cabin stirred to life. People shifted in their seats, reaching for books, tablets, or simply stretching cramped legs. David Graham remained still, watching the steady blinking light on the wing outside the window, steady as a heartbeat. Every once in a while he caught a reflection in the glass, a face from the cabin, glancing his way with something close to reverence, a silent nod of support. He wasn't used to it. Recognition had never been the reason he laced his boots tight every morning back in his Army days. You served because you served. You stood because it was right, not because anyone was watching. And yet, today they were. The attendant passed again, offering refreshments, her steps more deliberate when she reached David's row. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked, along with a small card tucked discreetly beneath it. David lifted the cup first, feeling the familiar weight in his hand, then pulled the card free and flipped it over. It read, "Thank you for your service and for reminding us what real strength looks like." There was no signature, No name. Just the quiet power of acknowledgement. David tucked the card into the breast pocket over his heart, next to the photo of his daughter. A man could get by without a lot in this world, but respect, genuine, earned respect, was something you never let slip through your fingers. Across the aisle, the teenage boy who had filmed the earlier confrontation glanced up from his phone, his cheeks flushed with excitement. He leaned toward his mother, whispering urgently, then shot a glance at David. David gave a small, knowing nod. He had a good guess what was happening. Moments later, the first tap came. A young man in a worn ball cap from a few rows back, moving carefully down the aisle as if approaching royalty. He stopped by David's seat, clearing his throat. "Sir," he said awkwardly, I just wanted to say thank you for everything. Not just today, for before, too." David looked up at him, taking in the nervousness, the raw sincerity in the kid's voice. He extended his hand. The young man shook it, his grip firm despite the slight tremble. Others followed, one by one. A woman with a baby bundled in a soft blue blanket, whispering her gratitude. A businessman in a crisp suit and loosened tie, bowing his head briefly as he passed. Even the gruff-looking man who had complained earlier about the delay stopped long enough to mumble, "Way to handle yourself, sir." Each interaction was brief, but the cumulative weight of them pressed against David's chest, not in a heavy way, but in a way that made breathing feel fuller somehow, like the air itself carried meaning. The young woman in the hoodie from earlier slipped him a small slip of paper folded into a neat square. On it, in scrawled handwriting, "If you ever need anything, Veterans Support Network, we've got your six." David closed his hand around it carefully. From the corner of his eye he caught a new movement. One of the flight attendants approaching, but this time with a tablet in hand. "Mr. Graham," she said softly, crouching beside his seat to avoid disturbing others. "We've just been informed. There's media waiting at the gate when we land. Several outlets, actually." David raised an eyebrow. "Media?" She smiled faintly. "Yes, sir. It seems your story's already been picked up nationally. They want a statement, if you're willing." David leaned back slightly, absorbing the news. It wasn't that he feared the attention, but he also didn't seek it. His story wasn't about headlines. It was about every veteran who had been told to sit down and take less than they deserved. It was about every citizen taught that speaking quietly meant giving up their voice. "I'll think about it," he said simply. The flight attendant nodded. "Whatever you decide, sir, we're here for you." She rose and moved back toward the galley, and David turned his attention back to the window. The clouds beneath them looked like a field of endless snow, soft and endless. Somewhere beyond those clouds, his daughter waited. Somewhere beyond those clouds, maybe the country he had fought for so long ago was remembering something it had nearly forgotten. The captain's voice came overhead again. "Folks, just a brief update. We are starting our initial descent. Should have you on the ground within the next 20 minutes. Please secure your belongings." The cabin stirred again. Seat backs clicked upright. Trays snapped shut. David slid his duffel out from under the seat, checking its contents by touch more than sight. Old habits dying hard. He zipped it shut and rested it on his lap. As the plane dropped altitude, his phone buzzed again. Another text from Jason. "Press conference being scheduled for tomorrow. They want you to speak at the Veterans Resource Center. Big audience. Think about it." David tapped out a reply with steady fingers. Not looking for a microphone, but if it helps the others, I'll do it. The plane shuddered slightly as it descended through a pocket of rough air, but David barely noticed. His mind was turning now, wheels within wheels. What had started as a stubborn defense of a seat, a simple seat, had become something else. A symbol, a reminder. Maybe this wasn't just about him anymore. Maybe it was about what the country needed to remember. That dignity wasn't negotiable. That respect wasn't optional. That sometimes the quietest man in the room could change everything. The landing gear thudded down beneath them, and a few nervous passengers gripped their armrests instinctively. David simply tightened his seatbelt and sat taller. The plane touched down with a bounce and a long, roaring deceleration. As they taxied toward the gate, the flight attendant returned one last time, this time offering a small envelope. "From our airline president," she said quietly. "She asked me to deliver it personally." David opened it carefully, sliding the note free. It was handwritten. "Mr. Graham, on behalf of North Pacific Airlines and from my own heart, I apologize for the experience you endured today. Your calm strength reminded all of us why we owe our veterans more than just thanks. We owe you honor. Your seat will always be waiting. Well, with deepest respect, Catherine Lockwood, CEO." David read it twice, then folded the letter neatly and tucked it into his bag. The plane stopped. The door opened with a soft hiss. Flashes lit up the windows even before the jet bridge fully connected. Cameras, news vans, reporters in suits and microphones bobbing in the air like a sea of question marks waiting to pounce. David rose slowly, slinging his duffel onto one shoulder. His body ached in 100 quiet places from old wounds, old battles, but he stood tall. The young woman in the hoodie clapped softly as he moved down the aisle. It spread. Others joined. A low, respectful applause, not raucous but steady, filling the narrow metal tube with something heavier and finer than noise. Gratitude. David nodded at them as he passed, his heart full in his chest. He reached the jet bridge. The flashes grew brighter. Questions rang out like rapid fire. "Mr. Graham, over here." "Sir, how does it feel to be a national hero? What would you like the country to know?" David paused, adjusted his cap, and offered a slow, knowing smile. "Home step at a time, folks," he said calmly. "One step at a time." And with that, he stepped into the blinding lights, not as a victim, not as a viral headline, but as a man who had never forgotten who he was, even when the world needed reminding. The hum of the city was electric, alive with news trucks and hurried conversations as David Graham stepped into the cool morning air outside the Veterans Resource Center. It wasn't even noon yet, but a crowd had already gathered, a sea of faces, some curious, some proud, all waiting. They held signs that read, "Respect our veterans," and "Dignity is not optional," in bold letters. American flags waved lightly in the breeze, rippling like echoes of a pledge too often forgotten. David adjusted the collar of his jacket, the feel of the fabric grounding him. He had spoken in front of soldiers before, back when his hair was still dark and his back was straighter. He had given orders in battle zones, read names aloud at too many memorials. But this, standing before a nation that had suddenly decided to listen, felt heavier in a different way. Jason stood at his side, clipboard tucked under one arm, speaking low and fast as he updated his father. "You've got 2 minutes before the mayor introduces you," Jason said, adjusting David's tie, a simple navy one, the kind he always preferred. "Stick to the basics. Tell your truth. You don't owe them a show." David grunted softly, more amused than annoyed. "I haven't put on a show a day in my life." Jason smiled crookedly. "That's why they're here." From the makeshift stage set up under a white canopy, the mayor, a lean man in a charcoal suit, was stepping up to the microphone, clearing his throat, scanning the crowd that spilled beyond the metal barricades. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice carrying clean and strong across the plaza. "Today we gather not because of a scandal, not because of outrage, but because of a simple, powerful truth. Respect is not negotiable. Today we welcome a man who reminded us of that. Please join me in honoring Mr. David Graham." The crowd erupted into applause, a rolling wave of sound that made the flags flutter harder. David inhaled slowly through his nose, feeling the weight of expectation settle squarely across his shoulders. He didn't hurry. He moved with the measured steadiness of a man who knew how important each step was. When he reached the microphone, the applause softened into an attentive hush. David gripped the sides of the podium lightly. He didn't shuffle his notes, didn't clear his throat. He simply looked out at them, a tapestry of strangers who had decided that this small, stubborn stand of his meant something more. "I didn't set out to make headlines," David began, his voice low but unmistakably steady. "I didn't set out to cause a fuss." The murmurs of the crowd stilled even further. "I set out to get home," he said, pausing. "Same as a lot of you set out every day. To do something simple. To be treated like a person." He looked down for half a second, gathering his next words carefully, the way a man might gather something fragile from broken ground. "But sometimes you don't get a choice about when you have to stand your ground." Several people in the crowd nodded visibly, the emotion tightening across faces both young and old. "I wore the uniform of this country because I believed in it," David continued, his voice growing stronger. "I still believe in it. But belief isn't enough. You've got to live it. Every day, in every way. In the small moments, when nobody's looking, and especially in the big ones, when everybody is." Camera shutters clicked quietly. Somewhere, a veteran in the front row with a chest full of ribbons wiped his eyes without shame. "I stayed seated on that plane because moving would have said it was okay. It would have said that my years of service, my sacrifices, were worth less than someone else's convenience or pride. It would have said that a man's dignity can be negotiated, if the price is high enough." David's hand closed briefly into a fist, knuckles whitening before relaxing again. "I don't believe that," he said. "I never will." A rumble of agreement moved through the crowd like the first distant growl of a coming storm. "We owe each other better," David said, his voice lifting. "Not just for veterans, for everyone. For the kid trying to finish school while working 2 jobs. For the single mom ignored in a boardroom. For the man pushing a cart down the street who served under the same flag as I did, but was forgotten when his boots came off." The silence that followed was charged, humming, alive. "This country is built on the backs of quiet strength," he said. "Not noise, not flash, quiet strength. The kind that stands its ground with dignity without asking permission." David leaned slightly forward over the podium. "And we need more of it." The applause erupted again, louder this time, a thunderous, spontaneous thing. It rolled over him like a wave. It wasn't for him, he knew. Not really. It was for the idea, the memory of who they could be if they chose it. David waited until it faded to a low murmur before he spoke again. "I didn't stand up for a viral video. I stood up because it was the right thing to do." He paused. "And you?" he asked simply, looking directly into the cameras. "What will you stand for?" The crowd erupted again, louder than before. David stepped back from the podium. Jason was there instantly, hands steady on his shoulder. "You killed it, Dad," Jason said, grinning despite the sheen in his eyes. David just shook his head with a soft laugh. "Didn't kill anything, just told the truth." As they stepped off the stage, reporters surged forward, their questions blending into a chaotic sea of noise. David didn't stop for them. He walked with Jason through the crowd, through the dozens of hands reaching out for a shake or a clap on the back, feeling the pulse of it all in his chest. The people weren't just celebrating a man who stayed seated. They were celebrating the idea that standing your ground still mattered, that dignity wasn't outdated, that integrity wasn't old-fashioned. As he moved through the throng, David realized he didn't feel tired, though he'd barely slept the night before. He felt alive. Jason nudged him gently. "What now, Dad?" David thought about it, a slow smile creasing his weathered face. "No," he said. "Now we make sure this wasn't just a story." Jason grinned back, a flash of the boy David had raised, full of stubborn hope. The two of them moved forward together, father and son, into the city's bright, unsteady morning, a future waiting to be shaped. One step, one stand, one small, unshakable truth at a time. The evening sun dipped low behind the city's skyline, casting long gold beams across the Veterans Resource Center parking lot. David Graham stood quietly near the entrance, his jacket slung casually over one shoulder, watching as volunteers packed away folding chairs and bundled signs into neat stacks. The big crowds had faded now, the media had finally drifted away in search of the next headline, but David stayed a little longer, grounded by the slow rhythm of normalcy settling back over the place. He preferred it like this, simple, honest. Jason approached from the side, holding 2 paper cups of coffee, handing one over without a word. They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, sipping, watching. "You sure you don't want to stay for the dinner tonight?" Jason asked eventually, half teasing. "The mayor said they're rolling out some serious barbecue." David chuckled under his breath. "Barbecue's tempting, but I think I've had enough ceremony for one day." Jason grinned, tapping his cup lightly against David's. "You earned it, though. All of it." David didn't reply right away. He let the moment breathe. He thought about that plane, the cramped seat, the heavy tension in the cabin. He thought about the faces looking to him now, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. "I didn't earn anything more than anyone else who's ever stood their ground," David said quietly. "I just happened to be the one who didn't move when it mattered." Jason nodded, understanding without needing more explanation. A few remaining volunteers waved goodnight, and David lifted a hand in return. Across the lot, a family was gathering up their kids, the father hoisting a sleepy toddler onto his shoulders, the mother adjusting a small American flag in the child's hand. Their laughter floated across the warm evening air, pure and unburdened. David smiled to himself, a slow, genuine curve of the mouth. He thought of the years that had carved the lines around his eyes, the long deployments, the nights spent writing letters under weak lantern light, the comrades he'd lost, and the ones he still carried with him every day. None of it had been for fame, none of it for gratitude. It had been for this, a country that could still, even now, remember what mattered when someone reminded them. Jason checked his phone, chuckling. "You're not going to believe this. North Pacific Airlines just issued an official statement. They're instituting a new passenger dignity policy. And get this, they're naming it the Graham Standard." David blinked, caught between disbelief and dry amusement. "You're kidding." "Nope," Jason laughed. "Full press release and everything. They're setting up a training program for their staff, mandatory respect protocols, veterans will automatically get priority seating, and there's an apology fund being created to support any future incidents." David shook his head slowly, chuckling under his breath. "Never thought I'd be a standard for anything, except maybe stubbornness." Jason clapped him lightly on the back. "You'd be surprised, old man." They lingered a while longer, finishing their coffee, until the parking lot had emptied to just a few cars and a scattering of paper cups rustling in the breeze. Jason's phone buzzed again, but this time he hesitated before looking. "You sure you don't want to do the interview with the evening news?" he asked. "They want to know if you'll go live. Could be a whole other audience." David considered it for half a heartbeat, then shook his head. "Already said what I needed to say," he replied. "Let 'em listen to what's already out there." Jason smiled, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Good, because your granddaughter's waiting." At that, David's entire face lit up, the weariness falling away like an old coat shed at the door. "She's here?" he asked, the excitement catching him off guard. Jason nodded toward the far end of the lot, where a dark blue SUV had just pulled in. The passenger doors swung open, and a little girl bolted out, all gangly arms and bright blonde hair streaming behind her. "Grandpa!" she yelled, her voice carrying clear and sweet across the distance. David didn't hesitate. His legs might be stiff, but his heart moved faster than any limp could hold back. He crossed the lot in a few long strides, meeting her halfway, catching her up in his arms with a soft grunt of effort. She wrapped herself around him tightly, clinging to his neck, her laughter spilling against his ear. "I missed you," she said, squeezing harder. David held her close, eyes closing briefly against the sudden, overwhelming warmth that filled his chest. "I missed you too, sweetheart," he said, voice rough with feeling. "More than you know." Behind them, David's daughter, grown now, radiant and smiling, approached at a slower pace, her own eyes wet. She leaned in to hug him when he finally set the little girl down, and for a long moment the three of them stood there, a small island of family, against the wide, noisy backdrop of the city. "You didn't tell me you were famous," his daughter teased gently, wiping her eyes. David chuckled, shaking his head. "Wasn't part of the plan." The little girl tugged on his sleeve, wide-eyed. "Are you really a hero, Grandpa?" David crouched low to meet her eyes, ignoring the creak in his knees. "I'm just somebody who did the right thing when it was hard," he said. "That's all a hero ever really is." She nodded solemnly, as if committing the definition to memory. Jason joined them, sliding his hands into his pockets, looking around at the clearing lot, the fading light, the world somehow a little different than it had been yesterday. "You coming home with us tonight, Dad?" he asked. David smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." They piled into the SUV, David sliding into the front passenger seat, his granddaughter insisting on sitting right behind him so she could poke his shoulder and ask 1,000 questions during the drive. They talked about school projects, about cartoons he'd never heard of, about her plans to show him the new treehouse she'd helped her mom build. As they pulled away from the Veteran Center, David glanced back once, just once, at the quiet building disappearing behind them. It didn't look like a place where a movement had begun. It just looked like a place where a man had remembered who he was and refused to be made smaller. And that was enough. As the SUV turned onto the main road, the city lights twinkled on one by one, and somewhere far above in the vast sweep of sky, a single star shone a little brighter than the rest. David Graham leaned his head back against the seat, the low murmur of family around him, and smiled into the gathering dark. "Yeah, not just a place, a feeling. A fight, once fought, that you could carry with you wherever you went. A fight you won not by shouting, but by sitting still and standing tall when it mattered most."